Well, I'd like to give you a bit of an overview of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, which eventually became the Delaware and Hudson. So if you'll bear with me, I'll give you some history, things that you might not have heard about. And that is how the railroad became part of the area going east and west from Albany to Binghamton. Now, from before the outbreak of the Civil War, the development of the railroad brought tremendous change to the United States. New businesses and towns developed across the newly laid tracks. During the war itself, the railroad played an essential role in moving both troops and supplies to the battlefields. And I'm trying to get the next screen to come up.
On your keyboard.
Yep, arrow forward. It's not going, Ron. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Power of the tracks meant power to control the movement of goods, people and money, but especially money. Railroads continued to develop well into the 1870s throughout the Northeast. The new railroad lines brought new life to older communities and spurred growth in small hamlets and villages along these lines. Now, down in Broome County, the New York and Erie Railroad arrived in 1848 and completed their line in 1851. By the end of the Civil War, several other lines had helped to make the Binghamton area into a transportation hub. But one more line was to be added to the list. In the 1868 era, Joseph H. Ramsey completed his vision of bringing his Albany and Susquehanna Railroad through this area. The line ran from the coal fields of Pennsylvania to Albany. It was not the longest of the railroad lines, or maybe the most impressive, but it was an essential link to the profits of the coal fields and the major lines in the capital of New York. One problem with building this railroad line was a major hill in the town of Colesville out near Harpersville. Rather than taking the tracks around or over this geographic impediment, the owners decided to carve out a tunnel to run the tracks through the mountain to complete the work. But by the late summer of 1809, the tunnel was open for trains to run through on their way to the new stops along the way. It was an engineering marvel, a tunnel that was 5/8 of a mile in length. People were amazed at all its completion with which it brought the attention of more than just the local residents. It also brought the envy and ire of the owners of the Erie Railroad, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. Both were robber barons who waged a war against the smaller railroads to control the lines that brought them millions. In the summer of 1869, Gould and Fisk began to buy up shares in Albany and Susquehanna stock, aiming to accumulate a controlling interest and install their own people to the board and take over. A&S President Joseph H. Ramsey reacted by issuing to his supporters thousands of shares that had been sitting on the company's books. Ramsey then had the books spirited from his office, and he buried them in the Albany cemetery. Incensed, Gould and Fisk had him suspended as president of the A&S by a judge they controlled on the New York State Supreme Court, George G. Bernard. Gould and Fisk also conspired to falsely arrest Ramsey. Henry Smith, William L.M. Phelps, and Robert H. Pruin, the latter three of whom were also executives associated with the Albany and Susquehanna. Ramsey applied to Albany Judge Rufus W. Peckham, both sides trying to force the A&S into the control of partisan recipients. Peckham succeeded, getting his order in first by a matter of minutes. Fisk stormed in the office of the A&S in Albany with hired thugs. He was taken to a police station by the A&S employee masquerading as a policeman. As soon as he was free from jail, Fisk returned to the A&S headquarters with a restraining order signed by Judge Barnard and a new set of thugs. They took over the A&S station at Binghamton, stole a train, and set off down the line to Albany, seizing stations as they went. A&S men flipped a switch to derail the cars. Fisk and his recruits met their adversaries, the men of the A&S, in a tunnel near Harpersville, where they attacked each other with all manner of weapons until the governor ordered state militia to take charge of the road. Men from both trains piled off and fought to gain the upper hand. Handles hit heads, rocks were thrown, sides pushed forward and then were thrust backward as the other sides tried to gain ground. The fight raged for 3 days until the state militia was called out to end the fight. By the time the state troops arrived at the site, Ramsey's forces had gained the upper hand. Not too bad, considering the Erie men outnumbered their opponents by 2 to 1. Despite the fierce fight, there were no casualties, except a loss of face for the Erie side. Realizing that he was fighting a giant, Ramsey leased his railroad line in 1870 to the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company for 99 years. The battle made national headlines, and it was adapted by Edna Ferber in Saratoga Trunk, as well as used in the movie by the same name. After all that, the only words left to describe the whole mess could have been uttered by Gary Cooper himself as the protagonist in the movie Yup. Now, John Pierpont Morgan, who had arranged a $500,000 mortgage for the road and had been appointed a trustee, arrived in New York on September 1 and was recruited by Ramsey's supporters. In the name of Dabney, Morgan bought 600 shares of A&S and made contact with all the shareholders loyal to Ramsey, ensuing that they or their proxies would be present at the annual meeting held in Albany on September 7. Personally supervising the voting, Morgan was elected a vice president and director of the road. Gould and Fisk counteracted by voting in their own men in separate elections. The case reached the New York State Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Ramsey's group's elections. Fast forwarding, on July 2 of 1945, the company was merged into the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. In 2003, Canadian Pacific proposed to abandon the 9 miles section from Voorheesville, New York to Albany County, filled a rail banking application, and purchased the right-of-way in 2009. Now we're going to take a bit of a ride, and we will start out in Albany. Imagine you're about to board a train taking place somewhere back in the late 1800s or perhaps the early 1900s. You've boarded at the Albany Union Station and you are headed to Schoharie County. As we pass through a few rural communities, we pass by farms and miles of farmed land, including crops, dairy cows, cattle. We've now passed Delanson, and the conductor is about ready to announce our first stop, Esperance. As we pass through a few communities, we pass these farms and we arrive in this station and we find out that we are some 3 miles from the village. The village, unfortunately, holds the dubious distinction of lying the greatest distance away from the railroad station, whose signboard bears its name, than any other along the ex-D&H Susquehanna division. Still, the town of Esperance was pleased to have its railroad and contributed $30,000 to aid the construction for the Albany and Susquehanna. Esperance rallied on its distant railroad station to assume a status quo. The A&S knew that the village relied on it too, so they put up a standard board and batten depot that carried a 21-foot wide by 74-foot long footprint, which housed a caretaker or agent's residence. From the furnaces, forges, paper and feed mills built along the Schoharie Creek, manufactured and agricultural goods were brought to the depot from shipments to markets. And from the farms of William Conover and Waldo Collette came bluestone that could be harvested in thickness of up to 12 inches. And while this harvesting and shipment of this natural stone product was long-lasting, the industry's most prolific years were during the late 1890 to 1910 period, when local legend informs us that over $1 million was made by the business. All that bluestone, by the way, was hauled to market by the railroad. The improved state highway eventually became a much easier way to ship goods. By 1930, the D&H company determined that revenue produced at Esperance did not even cover the cost of manning the station, which figured to be $2,469 that year. After a series of 5 hearings held by the state's Public Service Commission, the PSC ruled that the station be closed on March 1, 1932. Freight coming and going from Esperance could be handled by the Delanson station, with 2 trains coming and going each day with passenger service. And we move on to our next stop, Schoharie Junction. And as the state sign here says, Schoharie Junction, Schoharie Valley Railroad. It ran from January 4, 1867, with the last run on September 17, 1942. The length of the railroad was 4.2 miles. And then from Middleburgh and Schoharie Railroad, the first run was 10/19 of 1868, and the last run on 9/24, 1936. And the length of that railroad was 5.7 miles. We notice that there's a lot of activity as we roll into the Schoharie Junction station. This is a hub on the line as the Schoharie Valley Railroad connects to the main line of the D&H. We'll get off the train now to take a ride south to Schoharie and Middleburgh villages on the 4.2-mile Schoharie Valley Railroad. We will return here to continue westward. However, our train is now boarding for Schoharie. Noted as the shortest rail company that has ever existed, we will learn of the history of 2 independent rail companies and what they meant to the people residing in the Schoharie Valley. As we leave the station, the first thing we see up ahead of us, and if you see in the middle of your screen and look real close, we see a humpback bridge. The humpback bridge was a local landmark on New York Route 7, located 1 mile northeast of Central Bridge, where the road passed over the railroad tracks of the SVRR. As we leave as we get closer in 1867, when the contractor building the SVRR through that spot, he refused to lower the road bed. The state was forced to build the bridge high over the railroad. In subsequent years, the bridge was built even higher to accommodate the height of taller railroad cars. The narrow wooden bridge was built with steep approaches on either side and a flat section on top above the railroad tracks. The bridge was not a problem for horses and wagons, but a scene of accidents and even fatalities for motorists. Due to growth of the automobile traffic, it was finally torn down because it was an increasing menace to the public safety and replaced with a safer design of concrete in December of 1930. The old humpback bridge will be remembered as cars would fly down from Oak Hill, and if you weren't from the area, you would hit the top of the old humpback and become actually airborne, landing once again on good old Earth, causing much damage to the vehicle and at times, as mentioned, fatalities. In March of 1866, the Schoharie Valley Railroad received a charter to facilitate the construction of the 4.38 mile long railroad between the village of Schoharie and the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. In May of 1867, the Middleburgh and Schoharie Railroad received its charter to build its 5.75 mile long rail line between the village of Middleburgh and Schoharie Valley Railroad. The two towns again bonded themselves and brought stock to support the two ventures. By early January of 1867, the SVRR was making scheduled trips, and by the end of October 1868, the first A&SRR timetable was published. The early years of those railroads were a little rough, but once the wrinkles got ironed out, there were prosperous years, which lasted mainly between 1870 and 1909. Records of ticket sales show that in 1868, it cost $1.65 to go to Albany from Schoharie. Both railroads were very small branch lines, so many years they shared the engine house at the end of the line turntable in Middleburgh. For 6 months of the year, the Schoharie Valley engine was used, and then the next 6 months, the Middleburgh and Schoharie engine was used. One crew worked for both railroads. Both the SV and the M&S were originally built to a 6-foot gauge to interchange with the Albany and Susquehanna. This was changed to standard gauge 4-foot 8.5 in May of 1874. Now in December of 1896, an interesting note here, a cow was run over by the SVRR engine. The surprise was felt by patrons of the road who in 25 years experience never heard of anything so fast or reckless, was little ill-tempered, was learned later that the cow had been dead for several hours. Then in November of 1898, a train left Schoharie Junction for Schoharie. When it reached the village, trainmen noticed a passenger car was missing. It was later found as it somehow detached somewhere near the Larkin farm. Now that would be the most recent farm owner most of you might know as Merlin Sagendorf's place. It wasn't reported if passengers were on board the car. However, it was said this is like the Schoharie Dutchman. The farmer starts off to his field to plow, and when he reaches the field, there sits his plow, but he forgot to bring the team of horses with him. The SVRR had to cross the Fox Creek before coming to the village of Schoharie. There was a wooden Howe truss covered bridge built in 1867, which lasted until 1910, when it was washed out and destroyed. The new steel bridge not only served the railroad, but a whole generation of youth who used it as a diving platform at the swim hole in the creek below. Our station stop now is Schoharie. Arriving at the Schoharie station, we see horse and wagon ready to take passengers to one of the hotels in the village, like the Parrot House. We disembark the SVRR to get on the M&S for a ride to Middleburg. Many of our outbuildings here have been restored at the Depot Lane complex by the Schoharie Colonial Heritage Association, with a railroad museum, all this completed since the 1970s. Here we have the depot in one of the outbuildings. And for several decades after the railroad was abandoned, a dual passenger freight car sat out in the open field on the Middleburgh Flats. It was even used as a home for a period of time until Schoharie Colonial Heritage had it moved to the railroad complex in Schoharie for restoration. And this is the same car. After many years of fundraising and restoration, the railroad car became a focal point of the museum. And years later, they acquired an old D&H caboose that was added to the complex. Now, the economy of Schoharie was great with products shipped out through the railroad, connecting on with the D&H to points east and west and beyond. Railroad shipping records point out that following interesting information. November 1878, 1,600 barrels of apples were shipped. Average price paid, 75 cents a barrel. August 1880, 200 hop pickers arrived by train. June 1882, shipped 1,318 bales of hops. November 1883, shipped 237 cases of honey. September 1898, 500 fruit baskets are being made daily at the Middleburgh Manufacturing Company. They have sold 31,000 baskets so far this season. July 1903, one train shipped 70 tubs of butter, each at 60 pounds, totaling 4,200 pounds. June 1905, again, several carloads of flagstone shipped from a new Schoharie Valley quarry in West Fulton. March 1914, 2 to 3 tons of cassins shipped monthly from Borden Creamery. Cassin was used in piano keys, buttons, and toilet articles. The M&S engine, Middleburgh, and a combine, which is a combination passenger freight car, as you saw earlier. On November 21, 1872, this engine was damaged in a serious collision with an Albany and Susquehanna engine at the Schoharie Junction. This photo originally appeared on a calendar distributed by the First National Bank of Middleburgh. Now here's a photo of the M&S's newest locomotive, known as the Pony. She was built in 1855 by the Danforth, Cook and Company Locomotive and Machine Works in Paterson, New Jersey, as the Reindeer. After service in Cleveland, Ohio, she was rebuilt and sent to the M&S in 1870, where she served for 25 years. M&S engine number 2, photo taken not too long after it was acquired in 1895. Next station stop is Middleburgh. Arriving at the Middleburgh rail yard, looking towards the station and turntable off in the distance. The Middleburgh and Schoharie Railroad Station in the Middleburgh Yard. When the station was originally built around 1867, it did not have the larger canopy as shown here. The canopy was extended and ornamental wooden brackets were added through the private donations of a local Middleburgh resident. This antique clock once hung in the depot. After the station was closed, it was given to the Schoharie County Historical Society, and it now hangs in the old Stone Fort Museum. Now, this photo is a group of people at the Middleburgh Depot when the first group of soldiers left for World War I. Here we have the turntable. It means it's time to turn the engine around and head back to Schoharie. Sometimes you needed a small army to help clear the tracks in the winter. Arrival of CCC camp men at Middleburgh. Probably this is the longest train bringing in men for the CCC in 1934. The engine here pushes the boxcar across Route 30 at the Middleburgh Flats. The old crossing was near where the old Valley Bible Church stood before the flood in 2011. As we return to the village of Schoharie, we see a seasonal stop for the Schoharie Fairgrounds. The annual fair was located on the open lands currently owned by F.A. Guernsey Nurseries. The outpost was located behind the Deo property, the current Schoharie Library. Prosperity started to decline for both the railroads about the time of the First World War. When the federal government took over the railroads in the country and forced them to operate under regulations and mismanagement from which they never seemed to recover. About the same time, the Middleburgh plum was stricken by the disease called black knot. New York had been the third largest grower of hops to be used in beer brewing. And after the hop in the Schoharie Valley, that large industry began to fade away and dairy farming gradually took its place. Also at that time, feed dealers and creameries began shipping by truck. And here we are and back in Schoharie. And we have the M&S Board of Directors. By 1935, the Middleburgh and Schoharie had not been paying its taxes, and the absolute minimum maintenance had been performed on the railroad bed, tracks, and equipment. The tracks were in terrible shape, and the Schoharie Valley Railroad wouldn't even risk running its engine on the M&S line. The engineer would toot a whistle cheerfully and start to Schoharie on the morning run, but the locomotive would leave the track and wander in a direction of its own choosing. This happened not only once, but time and time again. Soon it became apparent that the engine had a mind of its own. Rather than chug peacefully on the scheduled run, it preferred to plow up scenery, squirting steam on the crops, messing up the roadbed, and jolting the passengers, if any were on the train. There were precious few of the latter. They were scared of that locomotive. Whenever small boys heard it approaching, they assembled at a safe distance to watch the wreck. They seldom were disappointed. Elderly ladies who had ridden on the M&S were known to have fainted later, just at the sight of its locomotive. It brought back memories, and the M&S never did kill anybody. The engineer was as frightened as the prospective customers. He knew how cantankerous was the locomotive, and he kept the throttle slow. He also kept himself poised, ready to jump. When the scarcity of brave passengers and the expense of the engine after every derailment threw the M&S into bankruptcy, John B. Bingham, appointed trustee of Federal District Court, did the best he could. He nursed that locomotive as it never had been nursed before. Schedules filed with the Interstate Commerce Commission, which watched the affairs of the M&S with apprehension, showed that on March 29, Bingham spent 10 cents of the company's funds on a new clamp for his locomotive. On April 1, he bought a new plug. On April 12, he spent 30 cents for an electric light bulb, and on April 16, he was forced to spend $3. He expended 12 cents to 2 bolts, and on July 2, 25 cents for a gasket, and then again on July 11, 50 cents for some valve oil. On September 24, 1936, the Public Service Commission had ordered the M&S to stop operation until repairs were made. It had been estimated that it would cost anywhere between $7,000 and $8,000 to return the track crossings locomotive to good repair. The railroad would never be open again for business, and the rough-riding, track-jumping, passenger-alarming, crop-ruining M&S, perhaps the only railroad in history to be bankrupt by its own engine. In March of 1937, the railroad was auctioned off for $11,000 and for scrap metal, with the 5.7 miles of rails bringing $18 a ton. A junk dealer, E.O. Friedman of Albany, outbid 13 others. The right-of-way for the A&SRR was purchased by the New York Power and Light Corporation, which had leased the right-of-way from the railroad to run its power lines 35 years earlier. Once again, we disembark the M&S train at Schoharie Station to board our ride to Schoharie Junction. Have your ticket in hand, all aboard. And once again, we've arrived back at Schoharie Junction to catch our mainline train back to Central Bridge. By the way, the station at Schoharie Junction in this 1936 photo was the property of the Schoharie Valley Railroad, but its second floor telegraph operator's bay window used by the D&H men to govern the movement of trains on both railroads. Station agent was Harry Cameron, who stands outside the station by the D&H main line. Several years earlier, a third track had been added between the junction and Delancey, which necessitated a need for a modern tower in 1923. Whether new tower or old operator's bay, the telegraph call was JX. Inside the tower was the most modern electromechanical interlocking switching system of the day, complete with a lighted map above the window to let the operator know which rail switch was on or off. This eliminated someone to physically turn the switch on the rail by hand. Also in the tower was the agent's desk used by Mr. Cameron. In addition to the telegraph used on the rails, you can see a candlestick telephone as well. Mr. Cameron's father, Fred, owned the telephone company located in Central Bridge. His sister, Lucy, was one of the operators. And one last note, the Schoharie Valley Railroad was founded by Jacob Froman and built by the town of Schoharie in 1866. 3 generations of Roman family ran the line until a son-in-law sold the family stock to the Delaware and Hudson in 1915. Schoharie Valley Railroad continued operation until September 17, 1942, when it too was closed due to changing times. After the SVRR was abandoned in 1942, she went up to the Hoosick Tunnel and Wilmington Railroad in Vermont, where she served a few more years. Here she is in the Reedsboro, Vermont in 1949. On our way to Central Bridge, back on the D&H line, or as we called it in earlier days, the Albany and Susquehanna train. It leaves the junction and we cross the Schoharie Creek via one of the steel bridges. The left one, built in 1865, and the right one was built in 1869. Through the farmlands of Peter I. Enders and into the heart of this small village that contained many businesses and churches one would need as a local resident. Ironically, we are not far from the birthplace of Central Bridge's most noted individual, who was born here in 1846, George Westinghouse. Westinghouse, of course, was the inventor of the air brake for trains. Westinghouse was 19 years old when he created his first invention, the rotary steam engine. He also devised the Westinghouse farm engine. At age 21, he invented the car replacer, a device to derail railroad cars back onto the tracks, and a reversible frog, a device used with a railroad switch. At about this time, he witnessed a train wreck where 2 engines were unable to stop their trains in time using the existing brakes. Brakemen had to run from car to car on catwalks atop the cars, applying the brakes manually on each car. In 1869, at age 22, Westinghouse invented a railroad braking system using compressed air. The Westinghouse system used a compressor on the locomotive, a reservoir and a special valve on each car, and a single pipe running the length of the train with flexible connections, which both refilled the reservoirs and controlled the brakes, allowing the engineer to apply and release the brakes simultaneously on all cars. It is a fail-safe system in that any rupture or disconnection of the train pipe will apply the brakes throughout the train. It was patented by Westinghouse, October 28, 1873. The Westinghouse Air Brake Company was subsequently organized to manufacture and sell Westinghouse's invention. It was in time nearly universally adopted by railways. Modern trains use brakes in various forms based on the design. The same conceptual design of fail-safe air brakes is also found on heavy trucks. And Westinghouse pursued many improvements in railway signals, which then used oil lamps. In 1881, he founded the Union Switch and Signal Company to manufacture his signaling and switching inventions. Our station stop, Central Bridge. As we arrive into the station, there is notably more hubbub here than any of the communities we've already visited. When the railroad came to the village in 1863, the village was originally on what is now Route 7 and is currently referred to as Old Central Bridge. The new village sprung up around the arrival of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. Also arriving at the same time was Daniel Webster Jenkins, who became the CB station agent in 1872 until about 1900. Jenkins also was a partner in the coal business, and he organized the first fire department, later named after him, the D.W. Jenkins Hose Company. He was a town supervisor and a great benefactor to the community. The new village station grounds had an eye appealing. It should have within this area a 24 by 36 passenger depot just on the north side of the main tracks. Adjacent to the depot stands a 37,000 gallon water tank. A 100,000 gallon water tank came later in 1918. These tanks were supplied by a reservoir built by the railroad to supply the residences and businesses besides the railroad. These tanks sure came in handy to quench the thirst of the steam locomotives before they climbed the hill, steep hill to Howe's Cave. Even the SVRR here for water came over here for water early on. The interchange passengers here as well as the Schoharie Valley Railroad built their own station at Junction. Behind the depot were several team tracks for use by less than a carload of shippers and consignees, and one which served a lumber yard. Central Bridge was not just a water stopover, but a place for food and drink, and at one of the hotels like the Austin House or the Barton House. Sometimes engineers stayed over and took a morning train back to work. There was a woman named Lizzie who lived on Upper North Main Street who had a horse. And evenings she would come down to the Austin and hitch her horse up out front. Lizzie would sit at the bar all evening with all the local men and at times the engineers. It was well known she could drink any engineer under the table. When it was time for her to leave the bar because it was closing, they had to take her out to the horse and throw her up over its back, tie her fast, slap the horse on the rear, and unfailingly, the horse took her home every time. Also on the railroad grounds was a 30 by 110-foot frame board and batten freight house. The railroad made a statement with such a large building, as they expected a lively freight business. The village had 3 rail crossings, and back in the early days, they were each manned 24 hours a day. In latter years, the need to take large trucks out of the village, the state built a bypass highway known as Route 30A. The need for an underpass was built in 1937, removing the lower crossing. The upper crossing, located at the dead end of River Street, was done away with, leaving only the main crossing in the center of the village. Hay business was big for the area. In this photo, you see the hay barns of William Collier. removing hay via sleds and loading them on train cars for parts unknown. Coal cars were unloaded at the Jenkins Coal Company, which was later taken over by Frank Bateholtz, who was also involved with the Sheffield Creamery. Farmers brought their milk to him, which the train delivered to various places. Your presenter here has a wooden Sheffield milk bottle crate with the label Central Bridge to New York City. S.K. Campbell Agricultural Works operated their business located in the middle of the village. They mainly manufactured threshing machines, and at the time they were in competition with George Westinghouse. The plant was close by the railroad, and machines could be shipped to most anywhere using the rail system. Central Bridge had its share of train derailments. In the early years back, probably up to about 1970s. They also had their share of building fires, but that's a subject for another time. The most notable derailment took place on April 25, 1944, when in the early morning hours, a number of high-octane gasoline tank cars were in a section of a 76 train car remaining on the track, when 35 oil tank cars ahead piled up on the outskirts of the village and caught fire. The concern was pulling the gas tankers situated in the heart of the village away from the burning oil tankers. It was in fear that fire would reach the rest of the train. In order to do this, engines needed to come up from Oneonta along with the D&H wrecking crew. Hundreds of villagers and people from surrounding area were out watching. Fireman Reginald Grantier shared a story years later about waking people up in preparation to evacuate in the event that the fires spread. If it reached the gas tankers, the whole village could be destroyed. Reg owned the Grantier hardware store and had tenants on the second floor. He hollered up the stairs to the woman to get ready and get out. She was beside herself, and when Reg crossed the street to talk with another fireman, he turned around and noticed the upstairs apartment was all lit up, and the woman he yelled to was in the window, stark naked, fiddling with the window shades. Oneonta D&H crew got there in time and separated the train. Investigators later determined broken carriage plate on one of the oil cars was to blame for the derailment. Portions of the carriage dragged along the track until it reached the switch, causing the oil car to be derailed, followed by 38 to 40 other oil cars, except for 3. The cargo from the other cars were coal, which piled up as gondolas overturned and caught fire by the flaming oil. The oil cars piled up side by side in a field, and the fire roared through the cars, setting up a reflection visible 25 miles away. Ditches were dug to channel the escaping oil and to save a nearby lumber yard. And firemen wet down the barns of the farm of Jacob Enders, where the derailment occurred. Several hundred feet of track were torn up, and telegraph and telephone lines, and the railroad signal system was damaged by the intense heat. The oil tank cars had the capacity of 8,000 to 10,000 gallons, which made the loss of fuel somewhere from 280,000 to 350,000 gallons. A ton of foamite was used and sent to Central Bridge by the Albany Fire Department. As I said before, there were many derailments. This one took place in 1964 when the train took out the depot. The D&H had stopped passenger service the year before, so the depot was no longer needed. However, it was rented out as office space for Ottman and Enders Oil Company. Burr W. Newby, a Central Bridge resident, completed 50 years of faithful service with the D&H, and most of his tenure he was station agent. Now, in the early days, there were many tramps and hobos that rode the rail system. There were many instances where Central Bridge and Cobleskill were meeting places for such characters who would travel around. Many were hired as hop pickers, and when picking season ended, they moved on. However, sometimes stories recount how some would never show up to work, and obviously they moved on somewhere else. A newspaper article tells about a dozen tramps interfere with trains, and local police raid the train. As police checked boxcars, they heard and saw them skedaddle in all directions. As reported, 6 of the ne'er-to-do-wells were arrested and put in the Schoharie County Jail for 30 days for uncoupling cars, meeting and messing with the brakes, and being free riders. There are many, many stories pointing in detail how these bodies were found along tracks with limbs severed, trying to jump in or out of an empty boxcar. Hobos might meet their fate. Sometimes these tramps would knock on doors of homes in the local area looking for handouts. Usually some bread, coffee, or maybe a hot meal would be offered, and then the homeowner would send him on his way. One tramp is thought to have arrived in Central Bridge late one night and was walking in the village streets. Later in the night, the feed mill burned. It was thought that the tramp might have entered the building and fell asleep with a lit cigarette. Nobody ever found a body, so if he was there, he probably left in a hurry. This is a good time for us now to jump on the next train and head west and visit Howe's Cave, where we will have a special surprise for you. We pass an eastbound train just out of Central Bridge. Station stop, Howe's Cave. We arrive at this quaint little depot where we will disembark and take a short stroll up the path to the cave house, where we will meet Lester Howe himself, discoverer of world-renowned cave. As you may know the story, Lester discovered the cave on May 22nd, 1842, when he noticed his cows gathering out in the sun instead of under a cool shade tree. When he investigated, he found the cool air coming out from the ground. Lester opened the cave to the public in 1843. His tours took 8 to 10 hours, and here stands Lester in the doorway to the cave to welcome you. We have a group of tourists that are visiting the cave, and you, if you were taking a tour back then, would be given special clothing and hats for your adventure, climbing over rocks, stepping into gooey mud, while trying to hold an oil lantern or torch, plus your boxed lunch. First big room we enter in the cave is Washington Hall. Then we go on to the music room for a concert. Musical instruments didn't always stay in tune due to the very high humidity. and the dam at the foot of the lake. A small boat was taken in the cave to cross the lake. And here we have the 1854 wedding of Lester's oldest daughter, Elgiva, who married Hiram Shipman Dewey on September 27 of 1854. Howe basically did this as a publicity stunt. Lester built 2 cave houses, both of them burned, to feed his guests and provide overnight accommodations. There is a story about a group of students from Union College coming out to see the Great Cave. In their journal, they mention Lester and say, "He talks big," meaning he exaggerates a lot. They spent the night in the hotel, and after their cave tour, some came out to the wagon to sleep because they say, "House full of bugs and in bed." Lester's tours dwindled and he closed the cave, and basically it was opened upon request. Then along came Joseph Ramsey. Remember him? Planning to bring the railroad through? He heard of Lester Howe and his cave. Now Ramsey, this picture that you see before you, he knew there was a high grade of limestone in the area and thought it would be a great place to mine. In the beginning, the mining would start underneath the earth, not in the cave, but drilling inside the earth. Ramsey negotiated with Howe to purchase his cave and property for $10,000. Howe refused. Ramsey came back to him and offered $12,000, not in cash, but in stock for the newly formed Howe's Cave Lime and Cement Company. Ramsey had 3 partners: Harvey Baker, E.R. Ford, both of Oneonta, and Jared Goodyear of Colliersville, and he bought 70 acres of land to mine. The new company reopened the cave and operated surface mining business. Lester thought that was a great deal and was made a partner. Unfortunately, Lester was not a businessman and didn't know everything of such dealings with stock. Ramsey began to make improvements to the cave, forming another business, the Howe's Cave Association. Tourists came from all over by train. He built a new cave house made of limestone that you see on the left. And a few years later, the Pavilion Hotel was built. An addition, very imposing, made of wood, Gothic style, where Lester Howe lived, was across the valley from this hotel. Howe would see what was going on, the mining, the tourists. He lost his interest in the cave, moved to Jefferson City, Missouri, where his daughter was living. However, Howe is buried in the Cobleskill Rural Cemetery. Now, the Pavilion Hotel, it burned in 1909. The story is a railroad engineer was up on the 3rd floor and fell asleep with a lit cigar. He awoke with his bed afire, ran downstairs and over to the cave house for a bucket of water. And by the time he came back, the entire structure was ablaze, leaving only the cave house, which still stands today. The railroad also brought something else to Howe's Cave, the means to ship in bulk quantity, the rich limestone. This is when Howe's Cave became a multi-industry location for both tourism and industrial mining. In 1898, the Howe's Cave Association Limestone and Cement Company became the Heidelberg Cement Company. In 1925, later companies for quarrying were Marquette Cement Company, Penn-Dixie Cement, Flint Coat Cement, and during these years, the cave house was used as offices for the cement companies. The plant was shut down again, and until 2002, when Cobleskill Stone Products took over the property for limestone quarrying. In 2002, Cobleskill Stone turned the cave house property over and land that covers the original entrance to the cave to a newly formed not-for-profit organization, the Cave House Museum of Mining and Geology. The purpose to educate how mining benefits each and every one of us. Also, the preservation of the original cave entrance and the local history of mining in the community is presented. Our train is leaving for our next stop, Barnerville. And as we round the bend, we are at the bottom of the hill in front of today's Howe Caverns, which opened to the public in this 1929 photo. Our train crosses an underpass that was put in place in 1930 due to the many car accidents that took place on the old railroad crossing from increased traffic of caverns visitors. As we near Barnerville, we assume that today's Barnerville Road is an ancestral road of Route 7. The hamlet contains a few residents and once had a covered bridge creek, although for 85 years when the railroad opened to Cobleskill in January 2 of 1865. The Albany and Susquehanna did not have any revenue, so it passed Barnerville without erecting any facilities. However, our station stop is Barnerville. The Barnerville folks desired to be placed upon the railroad map, so they erected a passenger depot and freight station with their own funds and muscle. The two buildings were placed on opposite sides of the track. Some of today's old-timers remember Ryder's Dry Bridge, which was used to cross over the tracks at Barnerville. Since the locals erected the buildings, they turned the private lands they sat on over to the railroad. However, when the Depression hit, the railroad decided to close up shop in Barnerville, and in 1933, razed the buildings and bridge. Now, in recent years, a gentleman by the name of John Taby, who wrote the book Roads, Rivers, and Rails, talked with me about the old depot. I had never seen the photo of the depot until John shared it with me. It finally hit me that the depot still stands today. I would drive past it every day to and from work at Howe Caverns. The building was moved downhill to the property where Dick and Eileen Gunlack live. The Gunlacks did not know themselves what a treasure they owned. We'll now move on to the village of Cobleskill. Before we arrive at the station, located at the center of the village, we pass Weeding Crossing, located at the east end of the village on Barnerville Road, and the bridge across the Cobleskill Creek, which ran behind the current Super 8 motel and connected to what is now Route 7. Here we have a crossing guard and his shed, and it looks like someone ready to board a train. And here is crossing guard Pat Murphy. There were 3 crossings, this one, South Grand Street, and West Side near the MacArthur Avenue intersection to Route 7. The first 2 crossings were replaced with underpasses around 1938, along with the bridge that is on Route 7. Arriving at the Cobleskill station in 1865, we would disembark our train at this stone structure, which was erected as a favor to Joseph Ramsey and Charles Corder, who both served as officers and directors of the Albany and Susquehanna. A baggage room was added to the north end of the building, and a restaurant also inside the building. The water tank next to the first depot. Notice the gas street lamp in the foreground. This picture predates electricity in the village. Now, if we were arriving sometime after 1900, we would see this beautiful new structure serving as the depot. Cobbleskill's new depot, architecturally pleasing, and like its predecessor, it had a restaurant inside. Across the street was the commercial hotel, which also catered to the needs of passengers. And there were several hotels and boarding houses, guest houses in the village. Cobbleskill's industrial base began with grist and sawmills. Over time, the town added a farm implement works, a sash and blind mill, 2 creameries, a steam planing mill, and 2 wagon shops, and even a couple of marble finishing mills. 2 of the most important families, the Harders and the Corders, both began with mercantile shops on Main Street. Charles Corder. Mr. Corder was president of the First National Bank. He is very influential in many ways, one being instrumental in the erection of the new Zion Lutheran Church on Main Street in 1868. The building project went over budget. However, the congregation and visitors on dedication day raised over $10,000 under Corder's leadership. Any overages Corder paid for himself. A mantle of deep snow covers the grounds here on this Valentine's Day 1914 photo. This is taken in front of the depot as the workers clean off the platform and the adjacent rails. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, who has something special to show you.
Okay, and Bob, this was taken in 1940s. 1940s, yeah. And this is a video of taken in Cobleskill. Okay, Bob, you can take it back over.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Looks like we're stuck here for a moment. There we go. For several decades, county students would be seen using the train daily to commute to school. Students were also treated to field trips by taking the train ride, usually from Cobleskill to Central Bridge, where school buses would meet them and return them back to school. Here we have the coal being delivered at the Cobleskill Coal Company. If you were a kid, back in the old days, I don't think it's allowed anymore, but maybe you put a penny or a few coins on the rail and got them squished. A lot of photographs were taken of trains in Cobleskill, and this one is one of the most famous ones that were taken of a D&H locomotive back in 1971. And it's actually a painting in this picture here, which hangs in my home. We're going to take the Schoharie Valley branch up to Sharon Springs. We're not going to go all the way to Schoharie Valley. And we're going to board this steam engine here. Now, the the Sharon and Albany Railroad originally owned this line, and before opening day, it was sold and changed hands to the D&H Canal Company. And here is the engine most used on that rail line. Here we have the switching station as you pulled out of Cobleskill on the Schoharie Valley branch. It was located on the west end. This was called KF, was the call letter for the telegraph lines. This sat somewhere near the crossing on the west end where MacArthur Avenue goes out into Route 7. Our first station stop is Hyndsville, a typical board and batten depot. And here in Hyndsville, we have a train with folks that are ready to board. This was in just before 1932. This was when the station was closed in 1932. And here we have a derailment that took place on August 14, 1910, near Hyndsville. Notice how the people are dressed to their finest. That's because August 14, 1910 was a Sunday. Our next stop is Seward. And here we have a box car along the side of the tracks, ready to be loaded with milk from the Sheffield Creamery. And here we see a train that's heading back to Cobleskill from Seward. Our next station stop is Sharon Springs. As I said, we're not going to be going on to Schoharie Valley in this program. So we will turn around here in Sharon Springs. But here we have a photo of all the carriages that are lined up to receive the passengers at the Sharon Depot to take them to one of the various hotels throughout the village. Now we have to head back to Cobleskill to catch our mainline train to go westbound on the A&S to Richmondville, our final stop. As we leave the village and we cross the road to the Barnerville cutoff, just beyond the ascent to the Richmondville Hill is Big Bluff and the current Cobleskill Richmondville Central School High School. Is where the scene of this deadly derailment took place on July 15, 1941. Within the site of Big Bluff, the boiler of number 1510 exploded with a deafening roar. It was 6:05 a.m. and the last day of life for Charles Smith, Albert Price, and James Red Cleary. When the boiler exploded, the blast tore the cab containing the 3 crewmen of the engine, right off the engine. At the same time, the blast tore the boiler from its mountings on the locomotive's frame. The boiler somersaulted through the air, coming to rest on the main line ahead of the now boilerless engine. It was facing the opposite direction from which it was traveling. The skeletal chassis, still moving on inertia alone, then collided with the remains of the boiler, pushing it nearly 200 feet further up the road. After finally coming to a halt, the train was traveling a little over 500 feet from the time of the explosion. A total of 11 cars derailed. The cab and other debris landed in a nearby field. Since July 15, 1941, the countryside surrounding Big Bluff remains quiet, except for the sound of locomotives climbing to the reach of the summit of Richmondville Hill. Our station stop now is Richmondville. As we pull into the station at Richmondville, we note that the station is the only 2-story depot erected on the Albany and Susquehanna line. In this picture, we have Agent Joel Waldorf, operator Leroy Hill, and baggageman helper Orson D. Myers. Now, the Richmondville's Depot Street crossed the Cobleskill Creek and then climbed the hill to trackside. The freight house shows in the upper right of this circa 1910 view. The station stands behind the 2 buildings at center. A 1-story addition was placed sometime before 1918 when this photo was taken. From the inside the station, there was a commanding view of village below. Lots of activity appears to be going on as this large group awaits boarding the eastbound train. Inside the depot's bay window, agent operator John Ferris Lyon seems to be dressed to the nines for his picture. A D&H milk train has arrived at Richmondville's Sheffield Farms facility, where trainmen and milk station employees have turned out to spin all those milk cans into the milk car. The arrival of trains at the depot also meant that the community's mail had arrived. Mail bags are in the process of being transferred from the RPO car to the downtown post office. At communities where trains did not ordinarily stop, their mail was picked up on the fly. via the catcher arm, which is not deployed here in this picture. That is just above the mailman. Living in upstate New York, and it is winter still, we end our program with this particular snowstorm, which brought out a work crew to shovel the station platform. And it looks like the pile of snow, that some of this may have come down from the roof of the station house. I apologize for running over a bit. I hope maybe that you found out some information about trains in our county that you may not have heard about before. And I'd like to say thank you to the Sharon Historical Society and the folks listed here on this slide. And I bid you all a very good night.
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate the your presentation. I thought it was very informative, and we want to take some time for some questions. If you have any questions, type them into the chat down below. I did get a couple of questions about you had mentioned somebody by the name of Morgan. They missed the full name of the name Morgan in the presentation at the beginning.
Oh, John Pierpoint Morgan.
Can you say that again?
John Pierpoint Morgan.
Okay. And then they ask about the caves were discovered by his cows at the opening on a hot day, where they used earlier in history as possibly during the Revolutionary War. And is there a map of the cave that relates to the surfaces?
The only known use of the cave, and it is only a story passed down in the early days, the Native Americans hid out there, just in the entrance portion. They never wandered into the cave. They were very superstitious, so they did not want to venture into a black hole.
Okay. Let me see here. I'm trying to get into this is. I think that was all the questions. Let's see. Will we get a link to the presentation again? Yes. After this program is over, you will get a link to the presentation that is going to be on the Historical Society website. And there is Bob's email. If you have any questions for Bob, caveman12092@gmail. And our next program coming up will be on March 22nd. It's the Wild West. It's we'll be talking about the migration west, go west, young man, the miners, the cowboys, gunslingers, famous saloon madams, and ghost towns. So that will be the 22nd, and the link to register will be sent to you after. It should have been sent to you already. Here's the listing of the upcoming programs and the dates. We've got some interesting ones coming up. History preserved in quilts. How do you preserve family heirlooms? The history of ice cream in New York. Story of the Statue of Liberty. We've got some interesting Civil War diaries. There's been a lot of questions about Jewish life in Sharon Springs, and so we'll be talking about that in September. The Adler Hotel has really created a lot of curiosity seekers here. So we'll be talking about from heyday to present day. Then Pete Lindeman will be talking about a number of his stories in his new books. They may just have found James Tanner's legs. Very interesting program in November about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, 58 years later. And then the history of Santa Claus in December. There's our information for the Historical Society. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. There's our email. We're still working on the website, but we will have that up soon. But if you go to that website address tomorrow, we'll have a link to to this program as well. Like I said, you'll receive it in an email following the program. So we'd like to thank you all for participating tonight, and we'll look forward to having you join us at our next program. And thank you again, Bob, for your
you.
Thank you.